What is a union without a collective bargaining agreement? Welcome to our YouTube video series on employment law for unionized employees. My name is Christopher Neufeld of Neufeld Legal, and in this particular video we will be addressing a critical question for unionized employees. What is a union without a collective agreement? Now, we understand that a trade union or labor union is an organized group of workers who have come together to advance their collective interests as to the conditions impacting their work in negotiations with their employer. The unionized employees confer responsibility to the union leadership to represent and advance their position with the employer. These employment interests tend to be advanced and set out in a collective agreement, also known as a collective bargaining agreement. The critical question that we seek to address in this particular video is that in the absence of such a collective agreement, what is the impact upon the union and the unionized employees? Typically, the collective agreement represents the culmination of negotiations between the employer and the union, setting forth superior terms of employment for unionized employees as opposed to those set out in applicable employment standards legislation and court precedent. The collective agreement thereby codifies the enhanced work arrangement that the unionized employees are entitled to as a result of the union's successful negotiations with the employer. The procedure for the implementation and enforcement of the collective agreement is heavily reliant upon statute and must strictly conform to all applicable and necessary statutes in the jurisdiction of the unionized employee's employment. Without the collective agreement, the unionized employees are effectively devoid of any superior employment arrangement with their employer. In such a circumstance, they would be entirely reliant upon their individual employment contracts, applicable employment standards legislation, and court precedent for purposes of determining their employment arrangement. As such, the collective agreement is absolutely critical to the union, as it is the basis through which the union realizes a superior employment arrangement for the unionized employees, such that it is the legal basis for the union's power. The significance of a collective bargaining agreement to a union cannot be understated. For without the collective bargaining agreement, the union effectively lacks any substantive powers, as its powers typically are drawn from the negotiated terms of the collective bargaining agreement, including its ability to force the employer into a stipulated grievance procedure as opposed to the courts. This is a very powerful tool in the arsenal of the union, but it must be set out in the collective agreement, such that the employer is legally bound to comply with those specific written terms, as opposed to looking elsewhere. The collective agreement is quintessentially the union's power base, from which it derives its authority to pursue those superior employment arrangements. And without the collective agreement, the union in many respects is rendered powerless, as its only remaining power is to negotiate a collective agreement with the employer that would only at a later date come into force. So one can see the essential nature of the collective agreement to the union. And why else is this so important? Because even though most unions believe that they have negotiated superior pay arrangements for unionized employees, due to the complexities that exist between Canada's employment standards legislation, payroll calculations are all too frequently incorrectly computed, and this can create significant underpayments for impacted unionized employees, such that it can actually become necessary to circumvent the union, effectively eradicate the collective bargaining agreement and the union's grievance process, allowing the matter to be brought before the court, and realizing the unpaid portion of the unionized employees' legally earned money that had been previously denied by the employer's failure to meet the actual payroll minimums prescribed by the applicable employment standards legislation. This is only possible in certain jurisdictions, where the terms of the collective agreement contravene the applicable employment standards legislation, such that the collective bargaining agreement is rendered void, as is the case in the province of Alberta under Alberta's Employment Standards Code. This is an absolutely critical consideration, given that a void collective agreement is effectively considered to have never existed, And without said collective agreement, there is no union negotiated employment arrangement, and there is no grievance procedure so as to allow the union to attempt to resolve the employment-related matter on behalf of the unionized employees, or the employer to use the collective bargaining agreement against a rightfully aggrieved employee. Instead, underpaid unionized employees can effectively take control of the payroll dispute and litigate it with the court. And this is extremely important to understand for Canadian unionized employees, given the prevalence of employee payroll being improperly calculated per the computations contained in the collective bargaining agreements that all too often contravene the minimum standards set out in the applicable employment standards legislation, resulting in significant underpayments to those unionized employees. And in our legal practice, we are seeing this as a growing trend, which unionized employees need to properly consider, especially when they have been fired, terminated, or quit their union job. Thank you.